at the right time and in the right season, divine providence raised up somebody who could have become a great military general. Instead, he was to be a great military general in the army of the Lord. And we see some of that military spirit coming through in his spiritual exercises and spirituality. Inigo, better known as Ignatius of Loyola, of noble family and a man for the hour. In the days when there were no anesthetics, having his leg shattered by the shrapnel from a cannonball during the siege of Pamplona, he was given a forced rest. His healing was incomplete and he wasn't satisfied, and so he said, "Break it again." So without flinching, that was done and another operation took place, but it wasn't all that much better than the first, so he limped for evermore. But nothing daunted his spirit. At the age of 35, he was already a master at the University of Paris, that is, Magister, and he was referred to as the master. And he was to form intellectuals. They were ordained at Venice, the group, and they had a notion of going to the missions on the seas, but because the seas were rough and they couldn't get sailing, they took it as a sign of providence that the Lord was calling them elsewhere, and so they drifted towards the eternal city and presented themselves to the Holy Father. From that time forward they would be his own personal servants, hence the fourth vow for superiors, direct obedience to any wish of the Holy See, which was put in question after the Second Vatican Council, but maintained by the force of will of St John Paul II, and 2 popes later we have a Jesuit pope. Now these aimed at hitting hard, forming, educating the sons of kings, the cream of the nations, good intellectual work, so that they would have influence through those who were formed by them. And they were also great missionaries. Because the very severe 2-year novitiate of the novitiates worked on the will, they by the end were like corpses in regard to the will. That's the expression used, perinde ut cadaver, just like a corpse, because the will was taught to dispossess itself and the intellect to wed the will even in the reason behind the order given, so that it was mental and spiritual obedience, not just material obedience. So by the end of their 14 years of formation, we had torpedoes ready to be fired from a submarine, and these broadsides actually hit hard. We know the consequences. They got as far as the number of 35,000 just after the council, and the influence is still capillary. But they hit hard also precisely at the time when they were raised up. They were part of the Counter-Reformation, the Catholic Reformation, and these saintly young Jesuits had their own underground in England. In Oxford, Campion Hall is named after one of their giants, a great intellect in Europe, snuffed out by torture and rack and the gallows. So, they knew how to use what was out there. For week after week, the pace would continue, for there were always more homes anxious to receive him and more souls hungry for the sacraments. At times he would stay longer than one night. At times the danger of daylight travel would enforce a welcomed day of rest, because the pursuivants, the priest hunters, were becoming more active and more wily. Their great tactic, of course, was to have somebody present at the secret celebration of the Holy Mass would then betray them. Now, they had written this so-called brag This brag, in inverted commas, produced refutations from the government, and within a week Father Parsons had launched a counterblast. With the ingenuity and daring resourcefulness for which he became famous, he had managed to acquire a printing press. No small feat when even the purchase of paper could lead to his arrest and execution. St Edmund and Father Parsons recognized the importance of pamphleteering, but they judged that the time had come for a more substantial publication. Campion therefore set to work and composed the Rationes Decem, 10 Reasons, for the confidence with which Edmund Campion offered his adversaries to dispute on behalf of the faith set before the famous men of our universities. The brag had been called a piece of irresponsible insolence, but the 10 reasons could not be dismissed by intelligent men so airily. It was a substantial, documented, forthright defence of the Church and refutation of the Reformers, directed to learned men, based upon Scripture and the academic disciplines which they professed, and phrased in dignified and felicitous Latin. Bear that in mind, I'll return to it in a second. The audacity of the project was epitomised by the manner of its presentation to the world. When the scholars of Oxford repaired to the St. Ellen, this is the church which Newman had, to the Church of St. Mary for commencement exercises on Tuesday the 27th of June 1581. They found copies of the slender volume waiting for them on the benches. The fine these orations are the Anglican counterpart. The fine orations of the day went largely ignored as the book was devoured. So they were getting people who actually wanted to know the truth. St Edmund Campion was a naturally open and communicative man, and it may be because of this and familiarity of constant danger that he became lax after a year of disguises, hidings out, impersonations, close calls, and furtive journeys. He was captured at Lyford Grange, a Catholic house, by George Eliot. Eliot had been a servant in 2 Catholic households, and when he was jailed for rape and homicide, he won his freedom by informing on the religious practices of his former employers. The government often deployed such trash as priest hunters. Through servants he knew at Lyford, he got himself invited to Father Campion's Mass and listened to his sermon on a text of the day, and Christ wept for Jerusalem, which the saint applied to the present state of England. The recusants present remembered this sermon as the prelude to St Edmund's own passion. Eliot left as soon as he unobtrusively could, and with the nearest magistrate surrounded the house with armed men. Now, I heard this story first in class when I was about 13 from the history teacher, who wouldn't have been Catholic at all. It was a state school, and he said to us to listen, basically, are you sitting comfortably? Then I shall begin. And on he went to read this story out, and he had us riveted. And he finished the story saying, say what you like. These Catholics took their faith seriously. The search lasted almost 24 hours. remember now, they had Little John, Brother Little John, who made these hidey holes, and they were very successful. And some will never be discovered, they're so well made. And he, of course, eventually was caught and terribly, terribly tortured. In fact, he died under torture. So, almost 24 hours, when Campion was finally found, what happened was this: they'd abandoned the project, they couldn't find him, and they were going away, and they had one last look back, and the sheriff said, that bit there, between there and there, we couldn't actually go into. Let's go back, there may be something in there, and they got him. When Campion was finally found hidden in the dead space of a stairwell, he was paraded publicly into London and placed in Little Ease, a cell in the tower without light and too small for standing or for lying down. 4 days later he was taken without warning up the Thames to Leicester House, where Queen Elizabeth was visiting the Earl. Now, it had to do with Queen Elizabeth years previously. He was in the circles of the academic and the brilliant, and they were known to each other. After a brief interview, they came to the point: splendid appointments in the Anglican Church were awaiting him if he would abjure his faith publicly. He declined. 5 days later, the Earl of Leicester, his former patron, authorised Campion's torture. From July to November, he was put to the rack 3 times. The rack was a rectangular frame in which the prisoner was laid. His wrists and ankles were fastened at either end, and then he was stretched by means of a winch, so that his body was sometimes suspended in air. The effect was to pull his arms and legs out of joint, tear the wrists and ankles, and make respiration difficult. The pain was excruciating. Strong men fainted at the sight of the machine. Campion confided to someone that during his 3rd bout on the rack, he thought they had decided to execute him by means of it. Their purpose was to get from him sensational tales of Spanish gold, to foment rebellion and audacious plots to murder the Queen. Nothing of the sort was forthcoming, of course. Now, Brother Little John, I believe, did die on the rack. Before being hanged, drawn and quartered, when he got to Tyburn, he prepared a speech based on the verse of scripture in Latin, a spectacle unto angels and men, and so on, but he wasn't allowed to deliver it. He had fulfilled the promise he made in prison, to remain steadfast, come rack, come rope. And he had contributed to the fulfillment of an earlier prediction of his. There will never want in England men that will have care of their own salvation, nor such as shall advance other men's. Neither shall this church here ever fail, so long as priests and pastors shall be found for their sheep. Rage, man, nor devil, never so much. There was a huge Jesuit underground under Father Garnet. One of the young priests functioning therein was Father Gerard, who likewise was tortured. He was subjected to the manacles at least more than once, terribly. Manacles were the whole weight of the body suspended on the wrists. And he managed to celebrate more than once the Holy Sacrifice of the Mass with wounded limbs in the Tower of London. Eventually he escaped, And we have his diary, a very interesting bit of work. And he tells us about the whole underground and how it functioned. And he tells us also what had happened not that long before he was writing. It was precisely this ambit of Oxford where the academics knew things and were discussing things quietly. And this lady of good faith wanted to know what she had to do because she was confused. And she walked all the way to Oxford and found out this great academic and cornered him. Good Father, I know you are a man of God and you have a great intellect. I plead with you, upon your soul, to tell me to what church I must belong. And he calmly answered, because, madam, you asked me upon my soul, I will tell you. The church in which you must live, given the inconvenience of this present time, is the church of the King. But the church in which you die must be that of Rome. And with that he turned and went. She went away with her answer satisfied. He, sometime later, was going through the corridors of Lambeth Palace to talk to the Archbishop of Canterbury about some issue. And suddenly he felt a terrible, terrible pain in his innards, dropped to the ground and died. The first martyrs of the Reformation were the Carthusians, and they would have had this Carthusian chant which has come down to us over the centuries. They may have chanted it in the Tower of London, who knows? Sanctum Presidium Confugimus Sancta Genitrix Nostras Deprecationes ne despicias in necessitatibus nostris sera periculis condis libera nos semper Virgo gloriosa et benedicta Domina nostra mediatrix nostra advocata nostra tuo Filio nos reconcilia